Hey everyone, this is my build Amorphous, centered around optimizing the Gridwalker booster. If you're curious, the breakdown on the build is first, followed by some stagger combos, and the matches at the end. If you want to just skip to those, you can check the timestamps. Hey everybody. So a build challenge, as mentioned, this time focused on the Gridwalker. This is my build Amorphous, and I've learned through playing around with the Gridwalker that it is a very flexible booster that it kind of encourages you to make sure that your build has options to adapt to both an offensive and defensive playstyle. Let's take a look at the stats of the Gridwalker first, and we'll work backwards from our parts, like how they're forced into the build, and then the last few pieces that we can tweak around to better squeeze out some more performance. So the Gridwalker has extremely strong upward thrust at 6334 boost. It's the best. It's an S tier in the stat in that field, and then it has really good melee attack thrust. It used to be number 2 behind the Kakaku before the Flugel's buff. Now it's basically in line with the Flugel in terms of thrust, just a hair slower, but it's even more EN expensive to use the thrust, so we definitely won't be using melee attack thrust as our primary gap closing tool. The melee thrust will be usable on slower mechs, but against lighter mechs, we're going to need to have some other option. It's also worth noting that this is the lightest ideal weight booster in the game, and so weight is always going to be your primary concern for all of your parts. And then it also has quite poor QB stats, which is really interesting on a lightweight booster. Honestly, I feel like it probably needs a buff either to thrust or to something in QB, just so that it doesn't have to expend energy so much to dodge anything. Like right now, even missiles, you have to bleed off height in order to passively dodge missiles. So, but that aside, that's hopefully for FromSoft to address at a later date. Anyways, we'll be largely building a rifle kite build just because of the nature of the Gridwalker. It's going to be floating in and out of close to medium range relatively frequently. And so right off the bat, I think our 2 weapon choices are going to be very important, and also the FCS is going to be really important. Given that we're also melee lunging, though, I feel like capacity is king with all melee lunging builds. So we end up investing a lot of our weight in the generator to run the Sandhigh. This is going to give us both melee flexibility, but also the ability to stay in the air for a long time. It won't be a permaflight build, but our capacity will give us basically supremacy in the air in terms of having the most amount of time up there possible. We'll just quickly touch boots on the ground to get our energy back, and then resume the fight. Another thing I thought with the Gridwalker that was going to be nigh essential is these arms. So because we need to run super low weight, high melee specialization, likely high firearm specialization, these arms just stand out to me as being like the quintessential Gridwalker arms. They have one limiting factor other than just the defenses, which is going to be arm load, and most importantly though, recoil control. So there isn't a ton of recoil control in these arms. So from that, I was able to start off with the Harris just as the strongest rifle poking weapon in the game due to its projectile's velocity. And then I just played around until I could find a rifle that could work with the Harris without exceeding the recoil control. So that gave us the Rensetsu RF. The Talbot helps us in both close and medium range, by the way. That helps us for when we're rushing opponents down, but still gives us the ability to medium range opponents that rush us down, and even soft lock if needed be to improve our FCS. The melee weapon of choice was pretty forced, to be honest. I feel like you're going to run like a ranged melee punish or something with a really good lunge. Now, the ranged punishes, to me, didn't really take advantage of the melee thrust that a kite normally would use, so I ended up ruling these ones out. But the Pulse Blade gives us access to some of the most melee combos. It gives us a great direct hit punish on stagger. It gives us the ability to trigger the stagger and even do both. So you can actually stagger with the Pulse Blade, triple punch into Pulse Blade. So the Pulse Blade to me seemed like the most natural fit for the Gridwalker. It's got a good enough lunge to risk going up for punishes with slight height disparities where other melee weapons might struggle. And then it's just got the performance and everything in damage. It's got a good lunge. It's got a mini stun lunge. That's a big part too, is having a mini stun so that I can interrupt certain builds that have charge up weapons. Okay, so we've got the generator, the booster, the FCS, and the arm payloads and shoulder payloads decided. The Huxley just synergizes with the Harris and the Rensetsu are extremely strong if you're wondering why I run this. A, it works really good when I'm in close quarters. B, it works really good when I'm getting rushed down because it's a defensive tool as well. and see if I'm ever against kites or whatever, it really maximizes the amount of impact burst I reach with these two weapons. So if you look, the Rensetsu has 245 impact. The Harris hits for 285, and they both fire about once every 3/4 second, meaning that if you did the math, these two weapons together with the Huxley, not including the Huxley's impact, by the way, just these two weapons, preventing the impact from decaying on these two means that we're hitting about 700 impact per second. That's basically 2 ducats. So the impact threshold on these is arguably even more oppressive than shotguns because the hits are spread out. It's very hard to deal with, and it also bypasses shields a lot more efficiently that way. So yeah, the Huxley just was a no-brainer to me, and offers the ability to maximize these two weapons in close quarters and when on the defense when rifle kiting. Okay, as for expansion, I think Pulse Armor is probably the best on any sort of passive dodging, more kiting build. Melee normally wants to run Assault Armor, and you absolutely can with this build. It's just a bit more risky on some matchups, namely Terminal Armor users and extremely fast kites, because then it becomes a very much like if you don't secure the Assault Armor cancellation on their Pulse Armor, then you basically lose the fight. So yeah, I usually would say Pulse Armor is your best way to go with this build, but it definitely can run Assault Armor, just higher skill thresholds and a couple of matchups that are really tough, but there are also some that are a lot easier because you don't have to have the fight drag on so long, like against lasers, for example. Cutting short the time that they have to just chip away at you with lasers gets rewarded with Assault Armor. As for the body parts, I started off with the Firmeza after the arms were already locked in. Reason being, again, starting with weight and then looking for high stability as possible because we are semi-melee and we need that like pool to dip into so we can trade into our lunges. And then also it happens to have really good booster efficiency, which all the better. That helps a lot with our melee canceling and not spending all of our EN too quickly. After that, the legs were a natural choice. They synergize really well with the Gridwalker's weight capacity, and they also give good jump height, good jump distance. All of those are good for the Gridwalker, and then decent resistances, which is nice because energy resistance was going to be a problem with this build. So looking for opportunities to squeeze that in is always clutch. Finally, the headpiece. So I just went knockhead because I like the aesthetic, but also because it's super high stability for its weight, which is also in the bottom weights of heads. You can swap this out for the Alba head, just so you know. It does increase your QB reload penalty even further, so the base is 0.7, and honestly, I feel every 0.01 seconds. I managed to justify 0.02, but you're going to go even a step further if you throw on the Alba head. However, you get a slight EN buff, not anything I would really notice. The main advantage of this one is just the boost to resistances. So definitely you can run this headpiece. I like the look of the knockhead, so I ended up just going this way, but especially if you're considering purging something against certain matchups where you might be worried about that QB reload, I feel like this, I just like the aesthetic this way, and I was willing to just take this head because whenever I purge something, I'm going to get the QB reload penalty resolved either way. So that's basically the order and how all the parts work backwards from the Gridwalker, and we ended up here. One thing I also forgot to mention too is that you don't only have to look at purging the Rensetsu for the Pulse Blade Punch combo. There are also certain matchups, especially like with tanks, just with a ton of bazookas, something that you're never going to risk going in for the Pulse Blade Punish for, and instead are just going to rifle kite them to death. Just purge the Pulse Blade. So the Pulse Blade being purged also gives you about 1,000 EN to your supply efficiency, which is a major advantage with the Santai. So if their build is too scary to risk going in for the punish, especially because if it's not going to kill them and they're going to have a bunch of nukes ready as soon as you wake up and recover from your Pulse Blade animation, given the Gridwalker's really poor QB reload, there's a good chance that unless you just dodge perfectly and don't dodge early, you're going to eat at least one of those nukes, and so it's just not worth it with this light build. So keep in mind, the purge options here are not just locked in on the Rensetsu. You can also consider purging the Plasma Blade as well, and just rifle kite and don't get greedy for the stagger punishes. An Assault Armor specific tech, so if you cancel their Pulse Armor and your Pulse Blade was interrupted, your secondary combo is to charge up the Harris and let fly the charge Rensetsu right after. The recoil is a little finicky on it though. I don't know why, but sometimes the charge Rensetsu just has recoil issues during that follow-up. So not to say that you shouldn't necessarily go for it or not, but just be aware that sometimes it isn't going to be guaranteed. Okay, so you have access, if you purge the Rensetsu, to the Pulse Blade into Triple Punch into Charged Terrace Punish. You could also do the Pulse Blade, but only the first slash is actually guaranteed, I believe, because we don't stagger extend in between during the swap. A general tip, if you want to go for Charged Terrace shots, is to flash onto Soft Lock right before you release it so that you get the FC advantage. It can even like snap you 180. I've seen that happen a few times, and here's just an example of that happening actually. Make sure the Pulse Blade is already equipped in your left hand before you let it fly, and the Harris too as well. Here's the strongest possible stagger punish. It's really hard to land though, so I wouldn't recommend it. But basically, you charge up the Rensetsu and the Harris at the same time once they're within stagger range of the Rensetsu's triple burst. Release the Rensetsu, QB cancel the animation recovery while swapping the left shoulder into charged Harris, then double slash with the Pulse Blade. There needs to be a wall behind them to prevent them from staggering backwards, just so you know. So for terminal armor users, when you're running assault armor, just do one pulse blade slash into assault armor. It's more damage than just doing 2 slashes and gives you a way to make use of it. Okay, so Harris and Etsugen with Javelin Beta. This looks to be more of like a backpedaling kite style build. It's always a big question, like, do I have enough burst down to stagger them before they stagger me? Usually yes, with the Harris and Rensetsu plus the Huxley once you're in close, because we have the assault boost advantage. So I get impact reduction and increases to my impact, and my weapons are hitting at roughly the same range as they will be. I mean, if they're running double Harris, then it might be a little bit more in their favor, but still, with our Huxley, as long as you don't spend too much time getting missiles in your face, you'll usually win the stagger race pretty handedly. I can't remember if I'm running pulse armor on this match, but if you have, the nice thing about this build is that you don't actually have to worry about countering their pulse armor with your assault armor. It's not like critical to the victory. But yeah, you can just see like once the Huxley starts helping, how quickly the stagger breaks off there. You want to make sure you leave enough energy before you stagger them to actually feather to be level and get the melee lunge off too. So yeah, I was running assault armor at this time. Definitely not as good of a matchup. That's probably why I was playing a bit more cautious, making sure I was close enough to counter the armor. I couldn't stagger them as quickly as I could have otherwise in the first round. Had to be in position to counter. All right, double Wurger. So that build is going to be very frightening to get in close with. It is a fragile build by the looks of the body parts. Well, not super fragile, but going for the Pulse Blade punish here is semi-risky. So I would even consider purging the Pulse Blade in this matchup. I wouldn't say it's necessary. It's just something to be mindful of, especially if they're running the Acellus. That double Wurger is not going to miss you with that terrible QB stat that the Gridwalker has. So it may be better in matches like this one, even though I didn't do it here, to just purge the Pulse Blade and just rifle kite to death. The big deciding factor is how much energy damage do they do. Are they going to bleed out my AP first, in which case I might need to keep the Pulse Blade to end the fight a little sooner. You can really see how the Gridwalker really shuts down people who try to use upward thrust to get away from melee punishes, because you're just always going to be faster. That was a good example. And also earlier, the pulse blade slash there, it's really nice because a lot of times you can get at least one slash in before the pulse armor deploys. That's another reason I ran with this melee weapon. It helps me end the fight a little bit quicker, which is something I need to be cognizant of when you're running a lightweight like this, especially a lightweight melee. You're playing against the clock a lot of times. Okay, on this matchup, I'm up against the Tetra with a really frightening close quarters armament. So the diffuse laser cannons are basically shotguns. I'm going to be taking chip damage from that the whole time, but I cannot afford to take that slicer punish. So I actually don't know what expansion he's running, but I would just suggest purging the pulse blade in this matchup. I don't think I do it in the beginning of the map, but I do figure it out on the second round, I believe. Just being like, I'm not ever going to risk the pulse blade against this mech, because worst case scenario, I mistime it and I take the charged Wurg and I'm dead, so it's just not even worth going for when I can rifle to death. The height command that the Gridwalker gives you is really cool against Tetras. You can always just lure them into a hover mode and then just constantly spend time above them. And then they got to waste a bunch of battery to get back up there. And to re-level you out, at which point you just drop down and just keep complicating it. Alright, here we're up against the Karasawa double Trenos. The Trenos are obviously to prevent you from wanting to stay at range, but I'll happily take the Trenos so long as I don't take the Karasawa into Coral Blade. So against this matchup, I think more so just going to focus on kiting. Pulse Blade could have also been purged on this one, but because they're a low defense mech and they are hitting me for a lot of damage, the Trenos, I think I just saved the Pulse Blade to finish off the fight on the last stagger that will kill them. So like, I'm not going to go for it on the first one, but the second time I would. Coral Blade still catches me there. If I had used my upward thrust a little earlier, you can even escape the Coral Blade. Okay, another impact per second close quarters build. So again, going to play the defensive style with this build. I'm not getting as many melee fights in this clip that I got from today, but or in all the clips I gathered today, but that's a shame. The build does have some really fun matchups with Pulse Blade, and you can even use it in lightweight kites. Something else I often do is I will use the double slash of the Pulse Blade to actually trigger the stagger and get the first punish in, so that when they pop their pulse armor, I've already got both slashes in as well. That is one tip that I didn't have a chance to show in, at least not yet, in these footages. for any Alula builds, definitely making them go into the air to fight is a really strong tool. Like they just do have terrible EN supply, or sorry, EN efficiency when going up into the air. So leverage your advantage for sure in those matchups. Okay, double Etsu lightweights. So in this case, I'm going to try to take advantage of the range advantage that the rifles have over the Etsujin, and just try to lure them into a backwards or a backpedaling chase. And then once they get close enough for the Huxley, activate that to just dramatically increase my impact per second by surprise on them, and hopefully get a stagger immediately into Pulse Blade, and then reset. I think the last clips here, when I was still running the Rensetsu AR and trying to like hone in on what the right shoulder should be. So split missiles were pretty good because they gave you a good option against rushdowns, because the missiles would scatter and then chase backwards. Like as they assault boosted through it, they would end up taking the missiles from behind. But yeah, the Huxley magnifying the weapons, I hadn't figured out at the moment, but I just never really thought of that with rifle kites. But it was a really strong pairing that works both in close and helps with the chase tanks too. Anyways, the AR performed okay. I really was hoping that it had a recoil advantage over the RF, if not from the absolute value, but at least from the burst fire nature. But no, the Rensetsu RF just seems to be even better in every single way. And the cost difference is literally marginal. So what this fight ends up showing is the value of the Pulse Blade's mini stun and having an option that can interrupt attacks. It's really good against and also turns off like a lot of pre-charged weapons. So that's one of the reasons I wanted a mini stun on the melee weapon, just to give that unique trait to the Gridwalker build. Alright, that's it for the build, so I hope you guys enjoyed the Gridwalker Amorphous, and give it a shot if you want to play around with it. It's really fun, it's very flexible, and fun to have those, like, just a lot of different tools in your tool belt against different types of opponents.